About this fascist growth thing, evil men with racist views, spreading all across the.
Hello. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Ariel. I am a member of the Collective Power Network and a member of DSA Los Angeles, where I'm co-chair of the Housing and Homelessness Committee, and I'm also on the steering committee of the National Housing Justice Commission. Thanks for joining us a couple days after a crazy election day for a panel about how DSA can build power. We kind of went back and forth the past couple days about whether this was still the right time to talk about organizational structure. Should we pivot and offer an assessment of the election instead? After all, the Republican Party is responsible for hundreds of thousands of deaths, and yet the Democratic Party will barely eke out a win for a candidate running on a return to Obama era normalcy that gave rise to Trump in the first place. The Democrats who have failed to protect tenants with strong eviction protections in our cities and states or fight for greater unemployment relief were not able to persuade masses of working class people that they had their best interests in mind. Shocker. Meanwhile, the same voters passed progressive policies across the country. We're going to keep repeating this fact because it's important. In Florida, more people voted for the $15 minimum wage than they voted for either presidential candidate. The point is clear, people want change, our positions are popular, and they can win. But we aren't strong enough to win actual power just yet. That brings us back to the point of this discussion today. It's clear, actually, that the timing couldn't be better for this topic. DSA is seeing a surge in membership, not just from people frustrated by the political moment, but because we decided to prioritize growth with our 100K membership drive, showing the power of a mass organization. So what kind of organization are these members joining? Although we can claim some responsibility for DSA's growth, so much of it has been passive in the past, and chapters everywhere are struggling to find their footing. Our membership is sprawling and decentralized, both on a national level and within chapters across the country. In the absence of structures for distributing organizing and decision-making, we have self-selecting committees oriented around issues people are interested in and chapters that are receiving little support. We have committees and chapters that aren't necessarily working together toward a shared vision. Instead, they are competing for members and resources or operating like completely separate organizations. Our current structure is inaccessible for most working class people and results in recruiting more and more of the same types of members, people who found us online, who are passionate about a particular issue, and available to attend endless planning meetings far from where they live or work. To become the mass organization that we need to win socialism, we need a strategy oriented towards growth. If we hope to have millions of members, we can't rely on passive recruitment strategies, and people can't just be funneled into organizational silos. Where can we strategically focus our membership to not only grow DSA, but win real material gains for the working class? We'll be diving into these questions and more over the course of the next hour or so, and I'm excited to hear what our great panelists have to say. I'll let them introduce themselves now before we dive into some framing questions for all of them to answer, and then some more follow-up questions after that. So let's start with Ryan.
Hey everybody, Brian Mosgrove here. We're having a little bit of technical things, as is always the case with the Zoom calls, with the videos and stuff. So we're getting that sorted out. But my name's Brian Mosgrove. I am a member in Metro DC DSA, also secretary for the chapter, and have served in the steering committee for a little under almost half a year now. So I've been a member since 2016. So happy to be here.
And Tall.
Hi folks, my name is Tal. I use he, him pronouns. I'm currently a member of the DSA Los Angeles Steering Committee, and I've been a member since January 2017.
And Rhea.
Hello, comrades. I am Rhea, pronouns they, them, and I'm the secretary of DSA Cincinnati and Northern Kentucky. I've been a DSA member since January 2018.
Great. So to kick things off with just a broad question, I once heard a leftist urge people to join an organization, or better yet, start your own. Explain what you think is wrong with that statement, why it's not only important to join an organization, but to join a singular mass organization. Why is it especially important to do so now? And whoever wants to go first, maybe raise your hand. we'll just start with Rhea then. Sorry, I'm not seeing.
All right. Well, if I can answer a question with a question. What's the point of joining an organization or of starting an organization? And it's not something that we do because it's fun. It's not something we do because we want to hang out with people. As much as I love all of you, I would not actually spend all my free time with the circle of people I know solely through DSA. We join organizations, and we start organizations because we want to contest for power. As isolated individuals under capitalism, we're powerless. But organized, collectively, we run the world. And we can build organizations that utilize our power as working class people to challenge the ruling class and assert control over our own destiny. If we have a number of different random scattered organizations, that's no different from having a bunch of random activists or a bunch of scattered individuals. We need a singular organization because that's how we can exert power, when we have masses of workers and tenants ready to act as one.
Ryan?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question, and it's sometimes hard to contextualize why it's important. Why does it matter that we have an organization at all? Because our objectives and our goals of having an organization really influence the day-to-day work, our tactics, our strategies that we adopt in order to carry those things out. I'd like to kick it off by sort of paraphrasing one of a quote from one of my favorite Marxists, Ted Grant, who kind of posed this question and said, what has been the determining factor in the success or failure of revolutionary movements in the past that we've seen throughout history? Is it because workers don't understand what they're fighting for? It can't be that, because workers live with the horrors of capitalism every day, denial of basic rights like healthcare, housing, the list goes on and on. Workers understand what's at stake and understand that real change is necessary. Is it because workers don't have the courage? Is it because they don't have the sense of self-sacrifice that's necessary to carry these struggles out to the end? That's not true. We've seen incredible self-sacrifice from working people the world over. We can give many examples, and I'm sure we'll get into some of them. Seen incredible levels of sacrifice, courage for working people to go all the way when the question of power is posed. So what is holding people back? The question that it comes down to is organization. You can have all the people in the world who understand what's at stake, who are prepared to go all the way, who have courage to wage those fights. But if they are not organized, then it doesn't succeed. And the successful revolutions that we've seen, the successful revolutionary movements, progressive movements, and so on throughout history that we've seen, they were organized. They had organization, more than just organization, more than just being, paper members is a term that gets thrown out a lot, of some sort of brand. They had a program, which is really the thing that makes an organization a real thing, which means ideas put into action, not just a laundry list of we want this, but an actual way to go about achieving them, which is what a program is. And we can look even just very recently at the excellent examples of the fight against neoliberalism and neo-fascism in Latin America, the heroic victory of Movimiento al Socialismo in Bolivia, the heroic fight to resist the imperialist coup in Venezuela, that these places and many other places we could go on and on, where they had organization. Not only did they have organization, but it had deep roots in social movements, in civil organizations, in the trade unions. Organization was not a secondary question in those places and in those movements. It was not something sort of just arbitrary or something that they felt like they figured out as they go. It was something that took very seriously these movements. What social base are they connected to? Because if they are not connected to one, then they are just a brand. They're not a real organization. So we'll get into all of that more as we go, but that's sort of to kind of set the tone. That's kind of how I see the question of organization.
Yeah, and lastly, Tal, what do you think?
Yeah, I really appreciate what my comrades have said, and I'm not going to go over it too much, but I really do think you can't overstress how much organization is about power. Right, we organize as leftists because we see an unjust world and we want to change it. And so everything we do and the way that we lay out our organizations and the way that we interact with other leftists needs to be about how do we collectively win power for the working class. So obviously, I think that's kind of like the external factor influencing, why DSA chapters need to organize and how we organize, and why we should do it, not in an individualist way, right? Not in a way where it's like where I care mostly about whether I'm doing what satisfies me. The like create my own organization is about, ultimately it's about figuring out like how do I get to do the activist work that most impacts me, or most makes me satisfied with my activism. And I guess I think that like in thinking about how we organize, we also really need to think about, right, how do we maximize the strengths of our membership? So how do we understand who our membership is, and the variety of kind of different types of people who are in our membership, and how do we put them together? How do we lay out an organization that maximizes their collective power? I want to mention there's really, when I think about how chapters should organize, I really think in terms of two basic kind of dichotomies, or they're not quite binaries, but of how we interpret our membership. One of them is, right, activists versus organizers, and then the other one I think is cadre versus mass membership. And I think there's room in DSA for members on both sides of both of these spectrum, but if we are going to organize, we need to figure out how to maximize the strengths of each type. So, right, when we talk about activism, a lot of this distinction is activism is usually focused on high visibility, external facing actions, where the majority of the people involved are deeply committed to an issue, usually through personal or shared political ideas. So these actions often focus heavily on media attention. It's things like attending city council meetings, holding small citizen protests. And like, while activist work can be influential and powerful, it can't be the majority work of an organization if we want to build a mass organization, because activists primarily talk to other activists. They primarily organize with other activists, or yell at people in power. So when they do that work, they are not rooting our organization deeper in the broad working class. And then on the second the axis, I think we often hear people talk about how DSA is like only activating some percentage of our membership, and it's true, but it's also the fact that DSA's biggest strength over other American socialist organizations is that we are massively larger than any of them have been in decades, right? That's primarily because those organizations have extremely high bars for membership, that they're cadre organizations, right? If you're a member, you can only be a member if you do this high level of engagement. So, if we want to get 100% engagement of our membership, there's an easy answer. We just kick out everyone who's not active, but that just marginalizes us. So instead, what we should be doing is we should reframe our conception of what active membership looks like, so that when we undergo campaigns, we do so intentionally in a way that maximizes the strengths of our membership, who are mass members who can't commit dozens of hours every week to DSA organizing. I'm going to go into more depth about these discussions in later questions, but I guess the biggest thing I want to frame up front is that every chapter should always be thinking about how we organize, such that your cadre, because you still will have cadre, spend your time organizing your mass membership into action. And how do you do so in a way that all of your actions are focused on bringing new working people into socialist struggle?
Thanks so much, everyone, for those really thoughtful answers. To kind of switch gears and get more into the like nitty-gritty tactics of how our chapters are working, what's the main problem that is holding your chapter back from growth, and what are you doing to resolve it? And are there any experiments that you've tried that didn't work? And let's go in the same order and start with Rhea.
All right. So I would say the main problem we're experiencing right at the moment is being able to effectively mobilize our entire membership in the context of COVID-19. And that's a problem exacerbated by work being partially siloed into a couple different branches. We're actually in the process of replacing those branches right at the moment. We're probably going to have a bylaws amendment to vote on that transitions branches into frontline teams based on specific areas of struggle and specific methodologies of struggle, rather than having more loosely defined branches. We're also building up our communications infrastructure. And we recently, for example, rolled out an email newsletter that was sent out on a weekly basis. And really every chapter should just be every week emailing every member, calling every member on a regular basis insofar as it's possible, and engaging our members in organizing just immediately where they live and work. The primary strength of DSA is that we have tens of thousands of workers and tenants who should be organizing in their apartment buildings, who should be organizing in their workplaces. That's work that will build up our organization and make it into a vehicle for working class power. In terms of experiments that didn't work, one experiment I would point to is we tried to establish like a neighborhood-based phone tree where we would have a captain for a particular neighborhood or zip code who would be tasked with calling all the members there, with each captain having like 10 to 20 members assigned to them. And the reason that didn't work is that it essentially came from the top down. We conceived of it as a chapter leadership, tried to assign phone tree captains, and what started off with a decent amount of engagement, very quickly we got to a point where it was difficult to mobilize even the captains, but we weren't getting a lot of feedback from membership. And it was a good reminder that our organizational structures need to be things the whole membership has had a chance to discuss and buy into.
Ryan?
Yeah, I mean, as I said in the introduction, I joined DSA in 2016. You know, I'd been on the left for a little while since about 2005. Been around the left. I'd even been a member of other socialist organizations other than DSA before I joined. And I think one thing is like really important to understand in terms of the organization that we inherited was not built for this. It wasn't even built for the work the incredible work that is already being done, let alone a mass organization along the lines of those that have waged titanic struggles across the world. You know, it was effectively in a lot of places not much more than an email list, not much more than a study group. This is nothing against the comrades, the phenomenal comrades who came before us, but this was the kind of work they engaged in. And when I joined my first social organization when I was 19, there was a joke about how I went to their New York meeting. There's like 6 people there, and they said, "Well, we're big in Boston." And I went to the Boston one. There was 12 people there. The left was very small. This wasn't something unique to DSA. This is something that was endemic to the left. And when you're small like that, much of the work is carried out through personal networks, through personal infrastructures. It's not necessary to have a lot of what could in that context look like obtuse organization or structures, all these other things. It didn't appear necessary. We're at a point now where it is vitally necessary that we have some kind of form, that we have some kind of organization in place to achieve like some of the tasks that I'm sure many members here that Rhea spoke to and many others are dealing with, of what the hell do we do with all these people? We have all these people now and we're growing, which is exciting. It's a great problem to have. It's much better. I take that over having to adapt to getting smaller. But what are we supposed to do with all these people? I decided to run for steering committee this past year in DC, along with a slate of CPN members and other comrades who shared a lot of our vision. We were able to actually sweep the steering committee in that election last year. So a lot of things have changed. But part of what kind of made me want to run was really just this prevailing mood in my own chapter, that the steering committee was an administrative body, and that was really all it was that they were in place to manage lists, to schedule meetings, book the rooms, and things like this. And I really found that really out of whack. I think that if we go into this work with the mindset of a small organization, then what we'll end up with is a small organization, just by nature, because an organization like that, one that bases its basic functionings on personal networks, on who shows up, who votes with their feet, on this or that or the third, then we'll continue to have an organization that is small, and those people who've come in, in the promise of an organization that will, be really liberatory, be a jailbreak for them in some ways, and be empowering in a stark difference from the disenfranchisement that people experience as soon as they clock in or clock out of work, or in so many other facets of their life. Without an organization that truly is prepared for that and making conscious decisions about how do we enfranchise more members, how do we develop more leaders, how do we carry out campaigns effectively, how do we become a pole of attraction in our city, our geographic region, how do we sink very deep roots into the working class, into communities, into workplaces, and things like this. If we don't have even the capacity to make those decisions, then it's a pipe dream. The idea of an organization that can be one that workers can take ownership over, it's a fantasy. If we don't take seriously how mechanically is that happening? How is that taking place? And so there's a lot I could go into, and I'd love the opportunity to talk more about that, and people can sign up in the chat with questions about what they'd like to hear more about or not. But really, I think that was something that I saw as a very present problem of this, running it as continuing to try to run DSA as an informal thing that really mostly catered to people who were already activists, and not one that was really able to make good on the promise that I think people expect coming into DSA, which is an organization that will be a serious vehicle for their agency and for their ambitions.
Go ahead, Tal.
Yeah, I think this is a great question. I would say, in DSA Los Angeles, we were one of the chapters that went from being the smallest pre-Trump November 2016 to being, by January 2017, we were like third or fourth largest chapter in the country. And so one thing that we had to do was we had to completely just invent new structures in order to just let people do anything. And so I think we fell into a pattern that I think many DSA chapters are still in, is that, give everyone the ability to run their own issue-based committee, let them come up with and do their own thing. They internally mobilize people that come to their committee, get mobilized by the active organizers within that committee. They kind of conceive of and execute a whole campaign all on their own. And they come back to the chapter every once in a while if they want, like a chapter-wide email to go out or something, and very little other integration with the rest of the organization. And I think that that is something we are, still kind of, that's still, in my opinion, the biggest thing, the the attention to, or the intention of seeing these committees as the primary place for members to go is still something that keeps DSA LA in, at least in, a very activist mindset. And I think, you know, personally, I have tried a couple experiments historically that did not work. Because, I mean, to talk about, you know, some of the issues in this is like, DSA LA recently had a massive growth this year, in particular into primarily into the San Gabriel Valley, which is a very, very immigrant heavy, very non-white part of Los Angeles County. And Los Angeles County, as you may know, is a massive county. It's got a huge, huge and varied population. And it's also governed differently in the city of Los Angeles versus the county of Los Angeles. So we brought in a ton of new members, a ton of non-white members, a ton of working class Latinx members who are excited about socialism. And the thing that most active members told them is, hey, go to just, you know, pick from these 15 committees and go to one of them, kind of regardless of whether or not that committee was, you know, doing anything at the time, no real help, like every committee operated a little differently. And so that was a really big barrier for us to not only, you know, grow, but like grow particularly in the areas where the demographics that DSA most desperately needs to. So something that I think we are now shifting to doing after a big, after a vote recently at our local convention, is shifting towards building regional neighborhood units for how people stay involved in the organization, and trying to really focus on engaging campaigns at, you know, we're split out into 5 branches. So at the very least, campaigns should be branch-wide or potentially ideally chapter-wide, but executed through these neighborhood units where people talk to people that they live near as a way to, you know, stay more deeply connected into the rest of the organization. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, and I encourage folks to keep submitting more questions to the Q&A box, and I'll just try to sprinkle some of those in, and we'll try to hit more at the end as well. But as a follow-up to Ryan, you know, there was a lot of talk around the 100K membership drive about whether we were ready to absorb new members and that we shouldn't grow for growth's sake. How do you balance the urgency of growing our numbers with developing strong onboarding and member retention practices? And how do you think growth could help with internal issues in the org?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is something that comes up a lot. I mean, there's, I guess I'll start with the simple answer, which is that intentional recruitment campaigns are at their core internal organizing campaigns. You cannot have an intentional recruitment drive without it forcing questions of, okay, we've recruited them, now what do we do with them? Or even the way of, and I'll give a concrete example in my chapter, and many people this probably has resonated. You know, when we're trying to say, okay, we have these goals, we want to hit these many members. Okay, let's just say the steering committee is on board with that. How do we talk to our members about doing this? How do we educate them about doing this? How do we follow up with them to make sure that they are supported, because it's intimidating to ask people to join the organization. It provokes those sorts of questions. And then when you have people coming in and joining and whatnot and wanting to get involved, wanting to do work, okay, then what the hell is the next step? You know, we've talked a lot in DC. One of the biggest things is creating that pipeline, which has always been an ambition in the chapter and never really fully come together. Always some component of it there's been an issue, and it's been a lot of experimentation to make it to get it to a place where it is now. In terms of the, you know, another question I'll touch on just briefly that intersects with this is the demographic composition of our organization. You know, we talk a lot about that in DSA spaces. How do we, you know, it's obvious we want an organization that is working class, an organization that is multiracial, multi-generational, multi-gender, and so on, because that is who the working class is in this country, and we cannot be a serious vehicle for the aims and the ambitions of those millions of people without being representative of them. One thing I think it's important to contextualize that conversation is that is not a unique problem to DSA. nor is it a unique problem to the socialist movement just in this current era. Every socialist organization and communist organization throughout history really has oftentimes had to overcome this issue of being mostly students, mostly academics, mostly from a more middle-class background. Whether you look at the history of the Communist Party in South Africa and China and so on, many of these organizations started from that milieu. So there are ways that have been gone about changing that and adapting to that. So we are not alone in having that problem. Of course, that doesn't change the need to address it. But having intentional recruitment, rather than just sitting back and saying, well, we'll grow, or we'll do big banner campaigns on Facebook or Twitter about join DSA or whatever, but actually the thing that I think 100K did very differently and wildly successfully, I think as well, is putting the onus on the member to organize where they are, not in a cliche or sloganeering way, but in a concrete way of organizing where you are. Talk to your coworker, talk to your neighbor, talk to the person in your faith community or what have you about joining DSA, why it's important to you and why you think the movement would be better with them in it. I think that's the kind of growth that we need to be moving towards, because passive growth, it'll just be more people it'll be more of the same, so to speak. And it's not to say that those people are bad or that we don't want them, but we can't overcome those challenges if we are not prepared to critically address them. And addressing them, having any kind of strategy, having any kind of plan, requires organization. It requires being able to say yes to certain goals and no to other goals. That's a very basic component of being able to formulate any strategy. Is you have to have bodies that can say yes and no to things. And if you don't have that, then any kind of strategy is really a fantasy.
Yeah, thanks for that. We also can't talk about growth without talking about DSA's accessibility to the multiracial working class. How do we sustain a distributed organizing model that realistically works around the schedules of, say, single parents and workers outside of our typical recruitment pool, which is downwardly mobile millennials from middle-class backgrounds? So maybe Tal, if you could start.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's a ton of lessons to be learned from looking at things like the Bernie campaign, which was extremely popular with Latinx workers across the country. But fundamentally, the question to me is our model of what it means to be an active member in DSA accessible to single parents and workers outside our typical recruitment pool? And the answer is no, right? Like, to be an active member, particularly if you're going to be involved in like the activist work of being an issue-based committee, or even if you're going to be someone who is like actively involved in like making detailed organizational decisions about the organization, right? That it requires a huge amount of commitment, even just to be like caught up on what the question is. If you have, for example, procedural general meetings, which isn't, and so right, like, realistically, I think that we need to be figuring out how to build campaigns and how do we build, organizational structures in which that ask for the average member of DSA to be a part of building DSA is something really, really accessible that requires a low amount of work. So I think that the simplest thing is things like phone banking and text banking, even canvassing sometimes. But even beyond that, like outside of the actuality of a specific organizing campaign, we also just need to be taking time to actively reach out to our members. Our so-called paper members are the people that broadly root us in the larger working class. And so that's not, I do think that requires, I always think about, I've read Max Elbaum's Revolution in the Air recently, and one thing he identifies as one of the key weaknesses of the new communist movement is that it had a ton of energy, a ton of really, really committed cadre, and they were not sufficiently rooted in a broader like fraction of the working class. So the cadres were almost always talking to each other, debating with each other, and not staying grounded in what is the working class actually thinking about and talking about. And so we need to have members who who are broadly part of that working class, and our cadres need to be talking to them as part of their day-to-day organizing, because there's no other way to stay rooted in what those interests are.
Yeah, Ryan, did you want to tackle this question too?
Ryan or Rhea?
Ryan, I think.
Oh, okay. Yes. Yes. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things that when we're talking about, we talk a lot about the paper members and so to speak, and is this growth, is it really translating to people who are active, who are engaged, or is it just, like the concern, legitimate or otherwise, that will we just become some sort of like moveon.org type thing where we're just a mailing list or just a brand or what have you that, doesn't really have much, internal life to it. And I think that, again, comes down to an intentional approach. Really, that has to start with the steering committee of a chapter. It has to start with any leadership that one is committed to making those kinds of changes for accessibility and to actually happen, and then to have a plan to implement them. Some of the things that we've done in DC, which I'm really proud of, is, we've tried really hard to make sure that members are able to get sort of the key information that they would need to have democratic participatory power in our chapter. Not just, there's democracy, we talk about a lot about internal democracy, but there's democracy and there's democracy. There's the democracy where you show up to a DSA meeting, someone says, I have this idea, and everyone's like, yeah, that sounds good. And everyone's asked to raise their hand, and then they raise their hand when they're asked to, and then they put it down and it's passed. That's democracy, but is it really the kind of democracy that we're actually striving for? Is that the democracy that builds a strong organization? Or is it one in which members are armed with information when they go into such meetings, but there's formats for debate and discussion and contentious fights sometimes? I mean, there's, as I said before, like the left was so tiny, 10 years ago. And it really started to come to life really after the Great Recession, but it was just literal decades of just the left being absolutely eviscerated for complicated reasons that are difficult, that are too numerous to get into here. But we don't really have a tradition in this country anymore, aside from some of the folks who have strong unions, don't have much of a history or tradition of real grassroots participatory democracy within membership organizations. So we really have to form that, and in that context, debate is very good. It's very good to have contention. It's very good to have, comradely, of course, but it's important. It's an important component to building that core strength, and it also helps shape what do these things look like in practice of building an organization that has more accessibility. So to kind of boil it down, I guess, to me, I think accessibility means, making sure that members are able to have as much participation and have real power over our decisions. And as chapter leaders, as more active members in the chapter or what have you, we may not always like it. We may not always like the opinions of other people, or the questions that we're getting are challenging, and we have to overcome them, and it forces us to take up new experiences. But that, I think, is how a real powerful organization is built. And there's really so few organizations like that in the United States. There, as far as I know, there are only 2 organizations in the United States where the national leadership is elected directly by delegates at a convention, and that's us and the NAACP. There are no other organizations like that. There are many that have democratic formats, but we really have we're very unique in that respect, and I think we're really important to the broader ecosystem of the left, and we're also really I think have a lot of potential to grow that out if we are doing it in a conscious way and really taking up approaches that are able to enfranchise those people, and that's something that in DC and in many other chapters there's been a real intentional way of enfranchising the membership, giving them real power, giving them a real say and a real stake in the successes and failures of our work going forward.
So speaking of growth and membership onboarding and merging some of the questions we got from attendees, folks expressed concern about how growth could lead to an influx of people who don't necessarily share our radical politics. So what is the role of political education in particular in member onboarding, and how do we sort of maintain our organizational lines when we aren't a super disciplined organization in the first place? Is there anyone who wants to jump in on that? Go ahead.
I can. So I think it's true. A lot of people are going to join DSA who don't have super radical politics, who don't fully understand socialism. That's also what happened when DSA first became a large organization. I think people forget, 2016, 2017, a lot of the people who were joining DSA were not socialists to begin with, were coming from backgrounds like liberal activists. But over their experience as DSA members, they moved to the left. There are people in my chapter who are hardline socialists, hardline communists, hardline anarchists now, who, when they joined DSA, they were essentially particularly enthusiastic Democrats. The experience of organizing with socialists is something that radicalizes people. To paraphrase Lenin, workers become radicalized in struggle. You go out for a demonstration against police brutality and you see cops lined up pointing guns at you. That's a radicalizing experience. You go out with your union on strike and you see your boss trying to cancel your health care, even though they've tried to claim, oh, they're a good boss, they're somehow beloved. That's a radicalizing experience. And as DSA leaders, we can be intentional about furthering that. We should have a developed political education program. We should have ongoing socialist night schools that we're encouraging all our new members to join.
Yeah, 100% agreed. And then another question for you, Rhea. Most chapters organize themselves around issue-based committees, as we've talked about. How might organizing by neighborhood and by sector be more strategic?
Yeah, so when I first joined DSA Cincinnati, we were with lots of issue-based committees. I think 15 of them, if memory serves. And I got put on one that was about tax. And it was supposed to end up in this big campaign about tax abatement and gentrification in Cincinnati. Problem was, there were only 3 people on the committee. So we had a bit of a... And that sort of issue is inherent to the committee structure. Divides our resources, it divides our members. And because of that, it increases conflict as different committees vie for resources and members become identified with the particular committees they lead. In Cincinnati, we resolved that by abolishing all those committees and adopting a system of chapter priorities where at our general membership meetings, 2/3 of our members vote on our major priorities, and that's what we're working on. And that's essential for developing any kind of socialist strategy. You can't have strategy if you don't have priorities, if you don't have campaigns that we're investing in collectively and putting all our resources towards. And associated with that, to build up the power to carry out those campaigns, our members have to be organizing where they are. They have to be organizing on the neighborhood level, in apartment buildings, and in workplaces.
Yeah, as a follow-up to that, there was a really good question submitted. What, in your opinion, is the right base unit for DSA chapter? Like most chapters, the base unit is issue-based committees that spin out and execute on projects relatively independently. So what are other models we could approach? Like, what should be the smallest unit that a member in DSA is involved in? And I'm happy to hear from anyone on this question.
I suppose we'll pick up from that. So I would say the smallest unit our members should be involved in is a cell. 3 to 5 members in the same apartment building or in the same workplace. And those are members who'd be tasked with organizing campaigns in that structure and with recruitment. I would say the cells should elect their own captains just to coordinate things within that structure. But they shouldn't be able to run like broad campaigns to name it a whole chapter. And then on a higher level, the DSA chapter should have teams organized around particular methods of struggle: tenant organizing, labor organizing, electoral politics. The key being methods of struggle, methods of contesting for power rather than particular issues. And then beyond that, there should be the chapter assembled the general membership, led by a democratically elected and authoritative political leadership.
Yeah, I mean, I really tend to agree. I think that in general, the best way to organize is on the basis of shared struggle, right? So if that means, if it's possible, right, that means, doing so in a workplace or at least in an industry. It's possible. It means doing it in a tenant building, apartment building, or potentially a neighborhood. But I guess the other thing I want to emphasize here is that for most members, right, like even those smallest units they're not necessarily going to take time out of their day to go to those every week. And so one thing that we need to be also thinking about in as we build out every one of those structures is how do we make sure that those structures are also reaching out deep down the membership and making the even smaller asks of, like, hey, DSA endorsed this person who's running to be your state representative. Can you make sure you vote for them and also tell your family about them, right? And hey, also, what do you think, right? Like both making these really basic asks of people, but then also asking them to give some feedback, right? And that's like, if we don't do that, we are not actually making the time to understand what our membership thinks and how we can move them to deeper into struggle.
Ryan, did you want to chime in on this too?
Yeah, definitely. One thing I think the question of how we break down this work is, I think, really crucial, especially when it comes to the question of leadership. One thing that I think that a lot of chapters have found, and a lot of chapters have tried to grapple with in a bunch of different ways, is like, if you get bigger, you need more leadership. You want more leadership because you want to incorporate more perspectives into your work. And you also just need people to run this shit. Like, someone's got to be helping, making sure that the work is happening, that the basic stuff is going on, and that there are people in place who can make certain calls when things need to be made. And the response that I've seen in some places has been, well, okay, our steering committee should go from 7 members to 12, from 12 to 15, from 15 to 20, 20 to 30, so on and so on. And then what you end up with is a steering committee that can really effectively do fuck all, because it's got so many people and so little direction at that point that it becomes kind of a mess. I don't think that that's a viable way to building our leadership, to growing our leadership. I think that leaders can be grown in a lot of ways. And if we have, and that work happens in the working groups as well, issue-based campaigns and so on, that work certainly happens there as well. But I think also incorporating more of like what the comrades are talking about, of more, branches or units or groups on the neighborhood level and on the workplace level is, I think, well, if we had a branch let's say we had a branch of Starbucks workers at the Starbucks on 9th and Lincoln or whatever, and, it only has 3 people in it, but they're meeting, they're talking to one another, they're doing stuff, they coordinate and whatnot, as a union organizer, if I walk into a campaign, any kind of campaign, and there's a committee with 3 people who are engaged, who've been mapping the workplace, that's like the jackpot. You know, it sounds like very little, but it also gives people the opportunity, whether it's on the neighborhood basis or a workplace basis or what have you, to take on more leadership responsibilities, to be leaders. One thing that we've had in DC, you know, we have, I don't know if a lot of other chapters have this, we have what's called the administrative committee in our chapter, which this is where a lot of the nerd stuff happens, managing the website, you know, doing all this other stuff. But, you know, in the last couple of months, we've really grown that out. And now that committee takes on a lot more ownership on, you know, executing campaigns, on taking responsibility for mobilizing current members, recruiting members, and also being that first point of contact with people when they come into the chapter. That's a massive project. That's a huge project to do all that work. So what we've done is we've implemented a steward system in the chapter, which gives people, you know, real responsibilities, real parameters, and it gives us it creating more surface area in the organization rather than having every responsibility fall on the steering committee or on ad hoc working groups that maybe are thriving, or maybe they're doing nothing and no one's heard from them in years or whatever. You know, I mean, that's an issue we've had in DC as well. And that's not good. The response to that isn't necessarily to say these aren't happening anymore. The responsibility, the next step then is to make sure you have a system where people are better supported. People, they have a clear sense of what being a successful leader is, because it's scary when you're like, you're going to be the next leader. It's a scary prospect, especially when people are so disenfranchised in basically every facet of their life and discouraged from being leaders of their, you know, coworkers or their neighbors or what have you. So giving people more opportunities to take on those leadership roles, whether it's in a neighborhood branch, on an administrative committee, or what have you, creating more of those opportunities, creating more surface area in the organization overall, I think is really crucial to building a dynamic organization with lots of leaders.
Yeah, so another issue that I've sort of seen result from this siloing around committees and issues is, I think members confuse democratic decision making with sort of the ability to do whatever they want in the org. How do you respond to that attitude and maintain membership appeal while also increasing organizational coherency?
I can jump in on that. So when I think about what democratic decision-making means in DSA, I often find myself thinking about something Lenin said. And that's that socialist organizations need to have absolute freedom and discussion, but also need to have unity in action. Our democracy as DSA is something that happens in our general meetings, where members come to vote on our policy and to elect our leadership. And members need to have the absolute freedom to introduce and vote on resolutions, to make arguments. But discipline after that is also part of democracy. If we're serious about being a democratic organization, those leadership elections have to mean something. Those votes in general meetings have to mean something. And we have to feel a sense of obligation to be unified in carrying that out. I would also say, to the point about maintaining membership appeal, what really, the thing about DSA that's really appealing to our membership, that really draws people to join, isn't the idea that they can work on like their pet project or whatever. And most people have plenty of liberal NGOs to get involved in. The thing that draws people to the DSA is the idea that they can win, that they can take power. And we can only take power if we're acting in a unified way with some kind of coherent strategy.
Yeah, you know, we're also not only tasked with growing the socialist movement, but also growing DSA. And I think people often ask, and we've got some questions around this from attendees, is why grow DSA and not grow a coalition or grow other mass membership organizations like labor unions, et cetera? How have you grappled with that tension in your local? Tal?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I guess I would say, right, if you have the opportunity to grow a union, you should take it. But it's not something that is necessarily easy. So I guess I would say that, like, I think there is both a tendency to assume that there are many, many mass organizations out there. And also, a tendency to assume, DSA is so imperfect that we have to always defer. And I guess I would say that, like, as much as, in my opinion, right, DSA has the potential to be a mass socialist, I would say, like, party, like Marxist party organization, right? Not necessarily like party replacing Democratic Party, although it would be cool. But like an organization in which people are united by socialist politics, and there just really are not very many of those. Many other organizations that are mass organizations united by socialist politics. So in my opinion, that's like our best chance at winning socialism, is building that in like to be a part of the broad movement, like for socialism. Like labor unions need to be a part of that as well, but we can't give up on the party aspect of the movement.
Rhea?
Yeah, coming off that, and we absolutely should grow labor unions every chance we get, but the working class can only win socialism if we have a coherent mass membership organization that we can act through. And honestly, on a national level in the United States, DSA is the only mass socialist organization in Cincinnati. We talk about coalition a lot, but I often find it kind of strange, because the fact is, well, I love all the non-DSA socialists in Cincinnati. I think they're great comrades. DSA alone is 2 to 3 times larger than the entire rest of the Cincinnati left combined. And I suspect that's true in a lot of cities. And even if it weren't true, we would need to be building up an organization that can act in a coordinated fashion, not a coalition that ultimately will have very, very amorphous politics with lots of different structures and programs operating in it.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of really good questions about how this model we're talking about would apply to rural chapters. When you're organizing around shared struggle, around your neighborhood, around your workplace, et cetera, and your chapter is extremely spread out in a rural area, that is much more difficult. How do you think we can support rural chapters in, mass work? Maybe Ryan, if you want to hit that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think one thing that's important to mention because we do have many members in rural areas and lots of parts of the South, although the South is not synonymous with rural by any means. This is something that's actually pretty unique for socialist organizations historically. The Communist Party, half of their national membership, and at one point it was 100,000 members, was in New York City. A lot of the rest of it was made up in major metropolitan areas in Northern and Southern California, Chicago, Detroit, so on and so on. So really having the kind of organization that we have today, where we're even able to pose the question of real democratic socialist organizing in rural areas, in suburban areas, in places that historically the socialist movement has not been able to really hold on to very much, is incredibly exciting. And it does pose unique questions and unique situations in terms of how you organize on that basis. And I think for that, the question is really sharp, I think, on that we need a national organization committed to those goals. It isn't something necessarily, and a lot of these problems are not necessarily things that is possible to resolve in a really complete way just on a chapter level. Some chapters will be able to deal with it. Some chapters will be able to kind of exist, as an island in some ways, but that leaves so many, literally thousands and thousands of members out. Regional organizations are really crucial to that. Having a broader structure, because we've talked about this a lot, but having an organization where there are two basic units. You have a national organization, you have the National Political Committee, and then under that you have a chapter. That's really weird in the context of mass organizations across the world, mass political parties. That's strange. Organizations don't typically have that. Now, when we were an organization of a federation of study groups and things like this, that made sense, but right now it does not make sense. And it's something we really need to pressingly deal with. But we need a national organization that's committed to those objectives. And without one of those, these questions will always be asking questions about: are we leaving behind comrades in rural areas? Are we not better able to? Are we set up to support comrades in places where it is very difficult to organize? Even if you are in a more metropolitan area, it's very difficult to navigate these issues, and they need national support. National support that doesn't come just in the form of a campaign in a box, but national support that comes in conversations about real support, a support network. Money as well is a big part of that. We talk a lot about the history of the Communist Party in Alabama and so on, and that legacy and all these other things. The thing that often gets left out of that conversation is that it cost a lot of money to shift organizers away from what they were doing in other parts, probably doing very vital work, away from there to go to Northern Alabama to go organize sharecroppers in those places. They had to be paid, they had to be housed. That is a massive commitment. An organization like that is making a phenomenal commitment, putting their values, putting their money where their mouth is on their values of building in the South, building in rural areas. I want a DSA that makes that commitment. And I'll also just say, I'd be a bad organizer if I didn't ask you to join my caucus at least once in the course of this conversation. There's a link in the chat. We need an organization that's committed to fighting for those things. And if you agree that that's the kind of organization we need, I definitely encourage you to join CPN.
I wanted to address some of the questions of how does this model of chapter organizing transfer to rural and other chapters. I fully agree with Ryan that a huge aspect of this needs to be regional organizations that are able to directly support chapters, so that not every chapter is doing it from scratch. I absolutely don't have all the answers, right? I don't organize in a rural chapter. And so I definitely can't say that I fully have experienced it, but I do think that a lot of the problems as described are similar to the problems that we dealt with in Los Angeles, which very obviously not rural, but ran into the issues of the core periphery problem, where we were organized in issue-based committees, and those issue-based committees typically met in person. They typically met in central Los Angeles because it was more accessible to more people. And that really, really left out the people who were not in the city of Los Angeles, who were far out in the San Gabriel Valley, far out down in South LA, far in the San Fernando Valley, Antelope Valley. And so shifting to, first we did basically big regional branches, and those were primarily a way to split the organization in a way that was more accessible, so that at these general branched meetings, we would talk about what the chapter is doing chapter wide, but talk about it in a place that is a little bit more accessible to more people. So I guess I would say, to the extent possible, you should try to organize your chapter in a way where you share as much as possible in terms of program across your chapter, but divide up into units that are regionally divided while still having enough members to keep the unit alive, right? And as you grow, hopefully you can grow and create smaller units where people are then eventually able to really work in smaller locations.
Yeah, on a similar point, sometimes DSA can feel more like a network or a brand, an organization that really functions together. You know, you both already talked a little bit about how regional structures would create more organizational coherency. So happy to hear you elaborate on that. But also, are there other things that we could try that would help DSA feel more unified and like it's an actual national organization working together? Anyone can hop in there.
Oops. Yeah. So I mean, I think kind of similarly, right, as the national organization, it like what Ryan talked about is we're such an organization that was built for a different organization than we were, in that previously, you know, we have structurally, we have a single national political committee, a single national leadership, and then nothing, and then we have every chapter. And so it's very, very difficult for those chapters to stay connected with what's happening. So CPN has advocated for a long time about that. We believe we should be building regional organizations that have a role to play, both in terms of aggregating and like connecting and supporting the chapters across that are within the region. You know, hearing about kind of what is happening, and then also both moving that up to the national level so that there can be, you know, more deeply informed decisions made about what national direction should be for the chapter or for the organization. And then similarly, that's a way that we can coordinate actions and decisions that are made at the national level and adjust them, right, as necessary, or implement them as is appropriate for the region at hand, right? I'll say in California, we ran a statewide campaign this year, but we did so after first having to bootstrap some kind of coordination statewide because it didn't exist previously.
So for members who are maybe feeling down on DSA or the left right now, what about the organization makes it the best vehicle for the socialist movement in the United States right now?
Well, I'll jump in and say I think, you know, obviously there's huge challenges right now. I mean, as any situation in which, you know, we're seeing effectively in some forms a collapse of the existing social order, and a new sort of capitalism is working to adapt to this reestablished sort of you know, political hegemony, not just in the United States but across the world. And this, so the results of the election yesterday kind of show that these two contending ruling classes, you know, represent themselves the Republican and the Democratic parties, you know, that they're in a pitched fight of trying to maintain control. And it's historically, you know, those are periods in which the socialist left are able to grow. One thing that I was really excited about is that I was a little bit worried going into the election day that, depending on a variety of outcomes, people would not be very energized. You know, there's periods, I've been around for a little while, and I've seen periods where people are very energized one year, and then the next year something happens, world events or whatever, and people can become very demoralized and and there's a recession of interest in the socialist movement and opportunities. But these ideas that we have as the progressive movement, as the socialist movement, are really on the world stage. It's really becoming more and more clear that, you know, there isn't really the Democratic Party, as much as they talk about, you know, racial equality, climate justice, gender equality, so on, trans rights, and the list goes on, as much as they like to talk about these things, they are unable to make good on them. They are unable to really mobilize and really cohere this kind of coalition that they think are constantly chasing, while also, you know, in reality, trying to win over the elusive moderate Republican that goes out there. At any rate, I mean, the only solution to that won't come about through just better messaging or better branding or the right slogans, the right time, or things like this, the kind of things that the socialist left were very fond of in periods where they were effectively small sects that had no power over anything. The things that will bring us towards actual power is to actually putting ourselves in a position where we can actually affect the terrain on which we're operating on. If we're able to, we talk a lot about mass movements and why we need mass movements and so on. I think we should be very aware that movements that aren't backed up by organization, that aren't backed up by program, that aren't backed up by a method of action based on our concrete goals, oftentimes don't win very much. They can change the conversation, they can affect things in certain ways, but without an organization, the results are incredibly mixed, and oftentimes leave those movements to be co-opted by politicians, by businesses, and so on, and it becomes, gets to, we all are kind of aware of the life cycle of those kinds of slogans. But that's why organization is so crucial. I think the opportunities right now are massive for DSA. I mean, we are moving it. We could potentially, one scenario we're looking at is a Biden presidency with a Republican Senate, which could mean, very unfortunately, potentially years of gridlock, of not very much changing or happening. That's not a desirable outcome by any means. We'd much rather be able to exert pressure on the national scale. But I think it also means that DSA needs to be able to adapt to be able to make the maximum amount of impact on municipal levels, on state and county levels, and so on, and really sort of focus in on how do we, in a very concrete way, not be just a pressure campaign, a pressure group, doing effectively lobbying or whatever, but actually running campaigns, actually organizing, leaving behind new organizations in our wake of these campaigns, building our collective power in significant ways, and really a more clear assessment of where the openings are on the local level. I think those things will really come into play very, very, very significantly. And I think that'll require some adaptation because it's not, many organizations have tried to be that kind of force locally in state, and not all of them have succeeded. So there's definitely experimentation and also, room to make some decisions about how we want to proceed on that.
Anyone else want to tackle this question?
I might jump in very briefly. Will I get canceled if I quote Margaret Thatcher? I'm going to quote Margaret Thatcher. There is no alternative. We're in a historical period where we're seeing a coming ecological catastrophe. I say coming, it's already begun. We're seeing economic collapse. We're in the middle of a pandemic that doesn't have a clear end in sight. And DSA is the only socialist organization in the United States with any kind of a mass base. For all its faults, and it has many, DSA is the only organization that can really act as a vehicle for the working class to take power in the time frame we need to prevent literally our species from going extinct.
And just a final question on chapter structure before we kind of wrap up. Besides changing bylaws and formal bureaucratic structures, how can a chapter create a culture that is more collective, democratic, and generally more favorable to the kind of structure that you've built in Cincy?
And this is where I ask everyone to join CPN. And I'm actually being kind of serious, not just calling on everyone to join my caucus as like this is a caucus panel. In Cincinnati, when we wanted to change our structure, and we started by developing critique, writing it down, and just having one-on-one conversations with members, getting inputs, adapting. And when we brought a resolution forward, yeah, there was a pretty big fight about it, a pretty contentious debate. A couple people left, got a little heated at times, but we came out of it a lot stronger and with a lot healthier chapter culture. And we did it because we had set the precedent that all our members have a voice and a vote in the chapter, and had set a model of having rigorous debate and not being afraid to confront our differences.
So, last statements from everyone. Is DSA ready for power?
I can start off. I think DSA's members are ready for power. I think that the communities we're operating in are ready for power. I think the workers that we're working on in coalition with and are joining our organization are ready for power. Is DSA as an organization ready for power? I'm not so sure, to be frank. I'm not so sure, because I think that there's still a lot of debate about what is the way forward. And I think there's a lot of, there's a lack of leadership, which I think is really crucial. You really can't build an organization that's powerful with a leadership that sees itself strictly as administrative. I don't think you can really build an organization that's powerful when you don't have lots of opportunities for rank and file members to take ownership over the work in more significant ways by becoming leaders in small and in big ways. I don't think you can build an organization that's ready for power if you're not able to formulate a strategy. An organization that says yes to everything, that says we're going to try it all, we're going to experiment all this other stuff, and that's not an argument against experimentation of trying things and whatnot. But if you are not able to say no to anything, you are definitionally unable to have a strategy. And who should be the one making those decisions? The answer is clear. It's the membership should be making those decisions. And like Tarea's point, and this is something we did in DC as well, making the general meetings, the general body meetings, asking them hard questions, having the debates out publicly in the open, letting both sides, make the arguments, and then we vote. Having priorities, having goals that are clear, that are also that you can tell if they've succeeded or failed, is really important to learning from our experiences. Like I said, there's no tradition. The tradition of the left and the movements that built the Communist Party and the militant periods of the labor movement through a combination of factors were largely eviscerated. Those organizations at their height, and we are rebuilding the left in a very real way, and so experimentation is crucial, and that experimentation should be as inclusive and as broad as possible, and that means having those things out and really having contests of ideas and saying, well, we think we should do this and we want to try this, and creating those kinds of spaces is how we get ready for power, and really taking a much more intentional attitude towards our work. I think that's one of the things that was really successful about the DSA 100K drive, is that when we put some intention, when we're not something that's passive, something that's just sort of a thing that happens, growth is a thing that comes from the firmament or something. It looks one way, but when we take an intentional approach to it, we recruited 8,000 members in a month. We didn't have 8,000 members in the whole fucking country when Bernie Sanders declared his campaign for presidency in 2015. We didn't have 8,000 members even then. That's an extraordinary thing. That's something that would be the envy of organizations the world over. And so I think that when we take that intentional approach and we really are clear and say, well, we think this is the way forward, and we debate those strategic and tactical questions, I think we can really shape an organization that is ready for power, and it might need some success, some failures. But I think it'll also mean huge success, because I think that is what it really truly means to have a collective project of building the socialist movement.
I would say, right, I think the way Ryan opened it up is exactly what I think. Workers are ready for power. Many of our members are ready for power. DSA organizationally is not, but we can get there. And I do believe we can get there. If I didn't believe DSA was our best organizational chance at a socialist future, I wouldn't still be here. But so what is it going to take? I think the biggest thing in my view is DSA needs to figure out what does it mean how to be a mass organization? How do we make sure that we are deeply rooted in a, if not the entirety of the working class, at least several major fractions of the working class? And that means our members need to be, even if our mass members, not just our cadre members, need to identify themselves as DSA members, as a part of their political identity, and not just, some other, one of the many, NGOs that I sent a donation to this year because I was pissed about Trump winning. And we need to build our structures so that our campaigns engage that mass membership. So we flex the entirety of our mass membership. We need to be rooted in the existing class fractions that we've made started building ties into, and we need to intentionally expand into broader class fractions. We talk a lot about one of the articles that CPN published earlier this year talks about the Democratic Socialist constituency, which I think is a really urgent for DSA to root itself in the broader constituency that supported Bernie Sanders. That's primarily brown workers across the country. We also need to really start making inroads in how we root ourselves among the Black working class in the country, and we need to do so in a way that doesn't require every single member to be to navigate an outrageously complex structure in order to feel like they're meaningfully a part of the organization.
Rhea, close us off with another Lenin quote. All
right. So I would agree that DSA is in a place where organizationally we're not ready for power. Our members are ready for power. Our class desperately needs power. But when we're not ready to take power, we're ready to contest for it. We're ready to be organizing with their members where they are, building up tenants unions, organizing workplaces, working to organize the South, contesting for power at every level, from individual and apartment buildings to neighborhoods, to cities, to geographic regions, to the United States as a whole. And it's in that process of contesting for power that we can build the organization that's ready to take power. At the risk of quoting Luxemburg rather than Lenin, the struggle for individual reforms, the battle in individual organizing campaigns is how we win the confidence of the working class and how we recruit the working class into our organization for the ultimate seizure of power. There can't be for us any distinction between our day-to-day struggle and our ultimate end of socialism and working class power.
I think that's a great way to wrap things up. Right on time. Thanks for everyone for coming and listening to this really great conversation, and to all the panelists for participating. For me, it sort of feels like this moment is like a reset button for DSA. We've been so embroiled in the, Trump versus Bernie versus, the Democratic Party mess that was 2016 through 2020. And the Republican Party is as strong as ever and will only double down in the next 4 years. And it is on us to get our shit together so we can win. And I think it starts with our organization and building up the structures we need to really be able to take power, as folks said. So I hope you all look into CPN if you aren't familiar with us already, and apply to join if you want to join us in building a mass membership organization in DSA. That's all, folks. And we recorded it.
Good night, everyone.
Share clips and such.
Good night, everybody.